climate calamity looms. Biodiversity is collapsing. Poverty is again rising. Hatred is spreading. Geopolitical tensions are escalating, and nuclear weapons remain on hair-trigger alert. Transformative technologies have opened up new opportunities, but also exposed new threats. And the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the world's fragilities. We can only address them together.
As the organization celebrates its 75th anniversary, we now have a chance to renew our commitment and loyalty to these ideals. Peace cannot possibly be dissociated from security. Cooperation among peoples cannot possibly be dissociated from freedom.
And I am proudly putting America first, just as you should be putting your countries first.
People of different countries have come together with courage, resolve, and compassion, which lit the dark hour. We have confronted the disaster head-on. The virus will be defeated. Humanity will win this battle.
The 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly is underway in New York, and anywhere and everywhere a diplomat can find a computer in a world swept by the coronavirus pandemic.
Hundreds of pre-recorded speeches and virtual meetings are taking place this week, many in hopes of advancing 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs, goals to transform our world, promote prosperity and hunger, and protect the planet that we share by the year 2030.
That can elevate what life is for you. Give me your secret.
The SDG Action Zone is a brilliant and ambitious production. We're excited to be watching it and bringing some clips in here and amplifying everything you're doing. But just briefly, I want to ask about the SDGs themselves. It's a bold agenda, 17 goals that change the world for the better. But in just 10 years to accomplish them, you know, what do you consider among all of those 17 the most vital tools to get that world to meet those goals?
I think it's, you know, the Secretary General often says it's about political leadership. He said it in Nations United, the global broadcast that we just launched earlier this week. It's about, you know, the power is in the people. We have to change the way we make decisions. We have to work in collaboration. We have to make sure that humans and society and individuals are at the very, very center of all that we do. Every decision we make, whether it's to purchase, you know, takeout, whether it's how our kids are being educated, have an impact and aggregate up into the transformative change. Governments, by and large, have the oversized responsibility, but all of us have a role to play in it, and all of us are agents in the change and in the creation of the future that we need to create.
Well, I think first and foremost was that we did listen to young people. I think that the 75 years is coming at a time when we've got an intergenerational shift, and it's to a younger generation in a period of time where the tools, the technology, where the next probably environment we're talking about is cities, and this huge cohort of young people. So I think the UN has to have a much more inclusive and networked multilateralism where there are many more people at the table defining and shaping the future. Of course, these goals for me help direct us in a way that brings us together in a much more interrelated way, as you said earlier, but also with the partnerships and the way that we should be. Peace is at the center of this. It can't happen without a respect for human rights. But the root causes of conflict, of instabilities in this world today can be found in the solutions that the goals provide. Inequalities, women not having equal access to basic rights and health and education, and you know, the injustice of poverty and hunger. Food systems that need to be redesigned to respond to a global population.
It really comes down to a few fundamental realities. The vast majority of healthcare practitioners do not choose to stay often in the global south. There is a massive brain drain, and we do need to reignite and re-energize a lot of local ministries of health and work with local ministries of health on their healthcare infrastructure. It needs to be better resourced. Let's be honest, if you have a GDP that allocates 247 hypothetically dollars per person, and you're putting that into infrastructure, you're putting that into education, you're putting that into numerous things, at the end you might have $6 or $7 for healthcare. It's fundamentally unrealistic. And so we have to really focus on that. And beyond that, we have to start asking ourselves what we define as healthcare practitioners. Around the world, there are a lot of incredible community workers that actually do deliver primary healthcare, and they don't have support, they don't have resources, and they don't have access to a lot of that healthcare infrastructure. And that's really important. Rather than saying we need to, recreate or bring new people in, I think it's really important that we recognize there are a lot of local health leaders that we need to support and we need to amplify and we need to work.
But often when we speak about marginalized or vulnerable communities, the tendency is to pathologize these communities as though who they are and the identities that they embody, as though those things are wrong and not the world in which they live, right? So my work as an activist is really to push back against that narrative, and vulnerable communities are vulnerable because they've been made vulnerable. They've been made to disappear, not just from public view, but from the discourse itself. I think a practical example is the way that we've been speaking about people with disabilities against the backdrop of COVID-19. We've not explicitly named the communities that are bearing the brunt of the pandemic. When we say people with underlying conditions, we need to name people with disabilities. We need to name the fact that Indigenous people, Black and Brown people in both the global North and the global South are disproportionately affected by the pandemic.
People can't feed themselves.
Right.
From one day to the next. They were living maybe in a job where whatever they earned that day was what they were feeding their children that night. And because of the pandemic, because a secondary, maybe unintended fallout from it was that they can no longer feed themselves. And there are people who are actually dying in COVID zones, not from COVID, but from other circumstances. So I think because this is the acute on top of the acute. I think that this is a priority right now. Let's make sure that the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't have those secondary effects that it is making vulnerable populations even more vulnerable. And at the same time, let's look at what the COVID-19 has exposed.
All our best laid plans have turned out to be of no use when faced with the ravages of an unknown virus. We have all gone down together. We should all rise together.
We've long been saying that the lifestyle we have created is unsustainable. Every year, we are consuming more resources than what nature can replenish. It is absurd to believe that we have unlimited supplies of natural resources.
COVID-19 reminds us that humankind should launch a green revolution and move faster to create a green way of development and life, preserve the environment, and make Mother Earth a better place for all. We aim to have CO2 emissions peak before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060.
We're at the Global Goals Studio, and right now we're talking about biodiversity of critical importance to a thriving world and the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
I feel like India is doing its best to invest in renewables. We initiated the Solar Alliance. We've just launched one of the biggest solar energy providers. We're also, I know that working with government agencies and business in the country, many more people are adopting the Sustainable Development Goals. But the fact of the matter is that when you're hit with such a huge human crisis like this, like COVID-19, it has set us back. And it will take a lot more effort and a lot more collaboration and participation to really push through on renewables and sustainability. But I do believe that India is committed in this regard, and we are definitely beginning to show evidence of the fact that we are willing and are driven to do more.
I think what we can say without any doubt is that we have had a major setback, and I think that is already becoming self-evident. As many of you might know, UNDP, as part of the UN's overall response, is providing the technical lead on all the socioeconomic assessments. They've been done in over 100 countries. The numbers are sobering, they are shocking, they are frightening. So I think in whichever way you want to measure progress, there is no question that we have had a major setback, and we still don't know how that will carry through into next year. But to those who always then quickly jump to the conclusion, does that mean the SDGs are no longer relevant? Are they unachievable?
Right.
I would say be careful, because out of crisis come extraordinary opportunities. And I think we have seen in the past also that setbacks can also focus our attention. Inequality will never be ignored quite in the same way as we have done perhaps in the last decade. When you look at our health systems, or when you look at our social protection systems, also digital connectivity or the digital gap suddenly has become a defining issue in the way that we look at our societies and their ability to move forward. So whether it is on climate, whether it is on digital, whether it is on inequality, I think much will depend on the choices that we make as societies in the years that remain. And just a last thought, the SDGs are goals. They are a way of thinking about development. They are a direction. The targets and indicators are meant to pace us. The goals are neither wrong nor become irrelevant if we don't meet a particular target on a particular date. But, you know, we have very little time, and we've just lost time, and that is the harsh truth. You know, one of the strange things about this pandemic is that it is in some ways almost unique in the fact that it is happening simultaneously across virtually every country. So UNDP is present in 170 countries. We are learning a great deal. Yes, there are some countries that are richer, have a more developed health infrastructure, or may have a social security system that can provide the kind of temporary basic incomes that people now need to survive. But there are also poorer countries that have the extraordinary capacity to leapfrog forward. We've seen the establishment of cash transfer schemes that have reached literally millions of households, hundreds of millions of people, and set up in just a matter of weeks, sometimes in economies where people would not have expected it. But in terms of worrying, I think it is both countries that are in conflict, because there it is most difficult to even be able to get to those who are most vulnerable. Whether it is Yemen, whether it is Syria, whether it is Libya, these are places where I think we truly are facing extraordinary challenges. And then where most of the world's poor are. And I think this is in part the African continent, where we do need to look very carefully. How do we help a continent that already has very limited fiscal space, as it is often called, to put in place the response measures? So UNDP is very much focused also on these two, let's say, geographies and contexts or realities.
So we're in a world now where, because of innovations in agriculture and technology, there is enough food to feed everybody. But that food doesn't get everywhere that it needs to go, and people aren't able to access affordably the nutritious food that they need to survive and thrive as individuals and as families. So one of our main roles as WFP is really to connect the surpluses to the deficit areas and the have-nots with those who have, and really make that connection. And COVID makes it harder, yet still, hunger is something that we can fundamentally solve. We have the tools, we have the technology, we don't have the resources right now, and that's what we're looking for.
We also advance the action for climate empowerment agenda. It has 6 pillars, which are climate change, education, training, public awareness, public access to information, which is very important, public participation, and international cooperation.
Hello, this is the Global Goals Studio. That clip was from this morning's SDG Action Zone conversation on climate education. It's Planet Day here in the Global Goals Studio. And right now we're talking about biodiversity. It's of critical importance for a thriving world and the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Chad is a beautiful landscape where we have a lot of wild wilds. And personally, I grew up with a lot of animals, insects, birds, and diversity of plants. But the climate change come and change everything. I'm seeing, just like I'm witnessing, I can say by my eyes, since I was young to now, how much we lost our ecosystem, how much we lost our species that we know. And it is not just losing it, but it is due to the climate change. It is a man action. I give you just an examples. The impact on our environment have a season change. We are having now a very heavy rains, and every part of the Sahel is flooding. Even in the cities, people just live with the canoe because there is a lot of floods. And 4 months ago, it was very dry, up to 50 degrees Celsius. And both of them are ending to the food insecurity. And it's impacting also our economy and our life and livelihood, creating conflict between the communities. So the climate change, it is not in the report only. It is not just the nice Paris Agreement that people talked about it. It is a reality, a daily life of my peoples and many other around the Sahel.
We cannot ignore the fact that humanity is connected. We've seen that with the pandemic. We continue to see it with climate change. We saw it in 2008 with the global recession. And these are all clear signs that we have to work together. International solidarity, international cooperation, and multilateralism remains essential.
That was Otto Saki from the Ford Foundation talking about the need for partnerships in the SDG Action Zone today. That's our topic today, making the business case for sustainable operations and partnerships. Making it work means building management structures and that promote procedures, practices, and systems that are profitable from a business perspective, while also improving the natural and social environments.
Thanks, and it was truly a monumental and eventful moment. I was pleased on behalf of the Global Compact to present the statement of support from actually about 1,200 CEOs representing 100 countries and representing companies that are both large companies as well as small and medium enterprises. And it was truly a support for multilateralism, which is again the theme of the UN at 75. This is important because at a time when, specifically as illustrated through COVID-19, borders shutting have immense ramifications for a lot of things in the business sector. Not only have people been able to move, not been able to move freely across borders, supply chains have been disrupted, the acquisition of goods and services across borders has been interrupted. This has had immense impact on businesses around the world. But I think more importantly, it's not so much about what has happened, but what should the future look like? Mm-hmm. And what do we desire as the Global Compact and our businesses for the world that we want and for the humanity that we want? And it's one where together we realize that the types of partnerships that we can build across borders, across business sectors, and really focused on what we call our 10 principles, which include the respect for rights, the respect for the environment, and the respect for anti-corruption, also anchored on the SDGs, can drive business forward. So the statement really talked about the need to respect rights, to ensure that there's anti-corruption practices in place, and also to really support a multilateral system of doing business and engagement was really what this statement was about.
It's really important for governments, for CEOs to just not think about themselves. Putting it as bluntly as possible, I don't want my homeland of Samoa to be sinking and dying before I do. That is nothing no one wants. And actually acknowledging the weight of this and knowing that it shouldn't be put onto solely the shoulders of our youth. And that's such an important thing to acknowledge. Although we are the futures of tomorrow, you still need to be making decisions today to ensure that our futures are safe and safeguarded. And so I definitely feel like everyone needs to be really looking at themselves, their privileges, what they can do, how they can do it, and really thinking about the most vulnerable they see in this society, and most likely the most vulnerable that they don't see.
Let me start by saying we didn't know to start with how children were affected. We actually thought, they are not directly affected, so will they be affected? But we learned very quickly that they are so affected by the consequences. The first thing we saw was the need to focus on education because everything was locked down, and we saw everywhere in developing countries and developed countries that we had to rethink how we do education. But we also saw the need for very basic health interventions, and we think through our priorities going forward, and they are very much, if you will, core priorities for UNICEF. We will have to focus a lot on vaccines to make sure that they are, equally distributed. We need to focus a lot on connectivity, because young children who cannot enter into the internet will be completely lost. And we see the opportunity actually in this COVID time.
We were moving forward, but in a too slow pace before the COVID-19. And the COVID-19 have given us a couple of severe setbacks. Of course, with so many children out of school, so many girls out of school, with the increasement of what we get reports of is more violence against women, probably more difficult to get the girls back to school and to secure safety of women. We also see that due to the fact that international trade has been so disordered, we also see that the possibilities of more problems with food supply the next years. Already this year, the food supply, the increase of people who are going hungry is increasing the numbers. So COVID-19 is giving us a setback, but I still believe that 2030 agenda is the most important thing that we can work on. And I think there is big possibilities for getting back into achieving this when we are working on building back better. But we have to build back better and greener. We can't go back just as normal. But I believe that Sustainable Development Goals is about the whole society. So, and as politicians, we of course have, and national leaders, we have a responsibility, and we have a responsibility to cater for the development both in our own country and in other countries. But you know, it's not possible to reach those ambitious goals without having businesses on board, having civil society on board. I mean, that's what the whole SDG 17 is, to say the goal 17 is about creating partnerships and that we are in this together. And I believe especially that businesses is important because they have to look at their core businesses, their supply chains, but they also have to deliver innovative ways of creating jobs, innovating new technologies to make sure that we can distribute both healthcare, but also cut emissions the next years from and make the oceans cleaner. And it's not possible for politicians to do this alone. So we really need forceful partnerships, and we need, especially we need the strong big businesses to understand that they should have surpluses, they should cater for decent work, but they should also use their innovative force on the other SDGs to make sure that we as a world are reaching them.
How do you assess the impact of COVID on the goals now set for 2030?
Well, I think, of course, everybody would share that opinion. COVID has disrupted everything, and it makes any sort of decision-making much more uncertain. We don't know when regular economic activity will resume, and consequently it's a much more fraught decision to commit resources to any kind of investment if you don't have any sense of what the future is going to hold in the near term. But we have to remember as well that we were already off track before COVID hit. And so now we have the opportunity, as we put forward a recovery plan, to start addressing some of the problems that we had faced in mobilizing resources for sustainable investment. And I think that there are two major problems that we have to try to address in that recovery. The first one is that government policy simply has not changed enough to be consistent with what governments have signed on to under the Paris Agreement for Climate Change or under the Sustainable Development Agenda. And secondly, there is still far too much of the available money flowing into unsustainable activities. It's still perfectly possible to make a good, healthy profit doing unsustainable things. And that's part of the problem that we have to address. It's hard enough today to mobilize new money for sustainable activities. It becomes much easier to finance the Sustainable Development Agenda if we stop putting as much of our existing resources to unsustainable activities as we do today and shift some of that money into more sustainable work.
What do you think about when you think about partnerships in the work that we do?
I think it's absolutely essential to the execution and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's what is the juice behind what needs to happen to get us there. It's about collaboration. It's about shared expectation. It's about making sure that those most in need are lifted and incorporated in all that happens with them in mind at the center of everything.
Great, thank you, Richard. It's great to be here at the Global Goals Studio. I mean, I think what you've all done with the studio and trying to bring all these different threads together that are happening around New York and really all over the world this year with this virtual nature of the UN. So it's really a pleasure to join you. And it was also great to see leading to this with my good friend Dauda there at the SDG Action Zone.
He's done amazing work. And I just want to sort of look at some of the bigger themes with you, if I may. You know, we're obviously talking about partnerships today, so is the SDG Action Zone. You work on partnerships. You are at that intersection of businesses and what the UN is trying to do, all world leaders on the SDGs. What struck you about the different panels, different events, the messages this week? It's obviously a difficult time for the international community with the pandemic and the recession, but what do you take from this Global Goals Week?
Yeah, Richard, it's certainly been a different week of the high-level week of the General Assembly and Global Goals Week. I mean, you know, not having the in-person diplomacy, which I think if there's one thing that was missing, it's the actual corridor conversations at the UN around you know, the diplomacy of this week. But I think what changed for the better is I believe these conversations were more inclusive because of the virtual nature of them. People didn't have to come to New York to be part of UN Week, to be part of Global Goals Week. And so I think what you saw from the various activities, events that were taking place was a wider breadth of voices in deeper conversations around partnership. You know, you're doing partnership in the studio today. The Action Zone theme for today was partnership. And I think in the true spirit of that, I've tuned into conversations at the Action Zone today and at the studio where you've had, you know, private sector leaders talking to government leaders, talking to UN leaders, talking to civil society folks, you know, academics engaging in the conversations. So I think that, you know, it's going to be an interesting mix as we go forward and we see, you know, what we're looking at in 2021 for UN Week. You know, whether we can be in person, let's all hope we can be in person, because obviously the backdrop of a global pandemic with COVID-19 has been, you know, made not just UN Week difficult, but lives difficult. And I think we should remember that, you know, we're losing, you know, so many lives daily to the pandemic, and it's a real, you know, tragedy that as we try and overcome it. And, you know, so I think what we'll see coming out of this year, where that's been the backdrop, how are we going to tackle the pandemic that COVID-19 is, in thinking about, as was raised in many of these sessions around the SDGs, how are we going to recover better using the SDGs as the backdrop? And I think it's going to take all the sectors that I just ran through, you know, plus everyone. You know, citizens have to take part in this and realize they have a responsibility to come out of this, you know, as they try and put their lives back together. If they've been sick, how they recover, how they put their family economics back together, you know. And so there's the micro issues that families have to deal with and individuals, to the macro levels, to the global economies, and the solidarity that we're going to need to see from governments and the private sector and civil society coming together to take on these issues.